Last summer, I made a video all about skipping a lure with a bait caster. So somehow, some way, that video has racked up over 500,000 views, but if you look down in the comments of that video, a lot of guys were asking questions about Baitcast Reels. So in today's video, I want to talk about 3 big mistakes that a lot of guys make with the Baitcaster, so stay tuned, it's gonna be a good one. Today's video is brought to you by Sportsman'sOutfitters.com. Right now, Sportsman's Outfitters is having a cabin fever sale, and you can save a lot of money on some of your favorite lures, your favorite rods, and your favorite Baitcast reels, all right now at Sportsman's Outfitters. So if you click that link down below in the description, you're gonna head over to the Sportsman's Outfitters website and you can save a lot of money on your favorite tackle. Now, over the years, I have fished with a ton of different brands of Baitcast reels. I fished with Abu Garcia reels, Daiwa reels, Fluger reels, Lose reels. I have fished a ton of different reels. Now, a lot of these reels are a little bit different, but a lot of the mechanics of them are actually pretty similar. So no matter what brand of reel that you use, you should be able to kind of clean up some of these mistakes, which is gonna lead you to a lot less frustrating fishing. The reel that I have used recently is a Bruin Outdoors ELS Signature Series Baitcast reel. This particular reel was designed and developed by Paul Elias, and it's used by a lot of current pros on different circuits, including guys like Caleb Summerall on the Bassmaster Elite Series. Now, whether you're just getting started with baitcasters or whether you've been fishing a baitcaster your entire life, one thing that a lot of guys get confused on is when to use the spool tensioner versus the brakes in order to get a better cast. I see a lot of guys adjusting the tension knob when they really should be messing with the brakes and vice versa. So let's quickly break down when you should use both. Now, when it comes to the spool tension knob, which is a little knob next to your reel handle, there's really only 2 times that I'm going to adjust the tensioner knob in order to help me with a cast. If you have it extremely loose, your spool is actually going to move back and forth because that knob, the tighter you go with it, it actually kind of compresses down on the spool. So if it's extremely loose and you click this button, your lure is going to fall extremely fast. Now, if you tighten this knob up all the way, your spool is not going to move side to side. And when you click on your button, your lure is literally not gonna move. Like there's nothing pulling this down right now. So really, in order to set this properly, I do not want it too tight, but I do not want a ton of play in my spool going side to side. So I'm actually going to tighten up the tensioner knob until there is no play side to side in my spool. Now, once I get it to that point where that spool is not moving side to side, I'm actually gonna just slightly back it off a couple of clicks. And to me, that's gonna be a looser setting. It's gonna allow me to have a greater casting distance. Now, if you're just getting started with a baitcaster, you might wanna go the opposite way. Get it to that point and then actually tighten it a little bit more. And that's gonna help you to not have to rely so much on your thumb to kind of slow down your spool during a cast. A lot of times though, once I set that knob, I don't mess with it a ton. Now, the one time that I do mess with it, if I make a cast with a lure and I tend to get a backlash at the very end of that cast. If I make a long cast, it's coming out just fine, and then at the very end of that cast, I'm getting a backlash, that is when I will tighten up the spool tensioner just a little bit. Now, the one thing about tightening up that spool tensioner is you may not get as long as a cast the next time, but it might help you with that backlash that happens at the end of a cast. Now, a lot of times when we backlash, it actually happens when we first go to like whip that lure out. We make a long cast right away, and as soon as that lure starts flying off, you're gonna get that backlash that happens right then. And anytime that is happening, that is when I use the brakes that are on the side of my reel. Now, no matter what brand of reel that you have, I'm going to adjust the settings on my brakes to be right at that 50% level. So a lot of reels, you're gonna have a minimum at 0 and maximum at 10. So I would set it at 5. Some reels go from 0 to 20, and in that case, I'm going to set it at 10. This Bruin reel actually has 80 different settings on it, so I'm gonna go again right in the middle, right at 40. quality. Now, the more settings that you do have on the side, it's just gonna allow you to fine tune your casting ability just a little bit more. Now, there are Baitcast reels that use centrifugal brakes. In this case, you're gonna pop off the side plate, turn on half of the brakes, or pop out half of the brakes, making sure the brakes that I turn on are on opposite sides of each other. Now, once I have the brake settings dead in the middle, I'm gonna start making casts. Now, if I'm getting backlash on the front end of that cast, I might tighten it up a little bit. But if you're not getting a backlash at all, that's great. I actually will loosen it up. I will kind of continue to loosen up, because really for me, I have found that the looser my reel is with its settings, the longer that I can cast. And sometimes getting a lure further away from a boat is going to help you catch a lot more bass. Now, once you kind of get all those base settings down, there are going to be times while you're fishing that you're going to need to adjust your brakes on the side. For instance, if you're using the same reel to cast a jig versus casting a really light topwater bait, when you cast a jig, it has a pretty high velocity in the air, so your brakes can be looser because your spool is needing to rotate faster to keep up with that jig. But if you go from a jig to maybe a light topwater bait with that reel, when you cast that lighter topwater, the velocity at which it travels through the air is not as fast as that jig. So a lot of times you're gonna have to crank up your brakes to slow your spool down, because if your spool is going faster than your bait is going, that is when you get a backlash. Now, another thing that will impact this is simply the wind. If you have that same jig and you're casting into the wind, again, your velocity is not going to be as fast. So that's when you're going to have to crank those brakes up to slow that spool down. Now, if the wind is at your back and you're casting with the wind, you might be able to actually loosen up the brakes to allow that spool to go faster so that you can get a longer cast. Now, the next mistake that I see a lot of guys make with a bait cast reel is actually keeping their drag too loose on a bait cast reel. Now, this is especially true if you're fishing lures with a single hook, like a chatterbait or a spinnerbait or a soft plastic or a jig. It's really important that if you're using a single hook lure, that you get the barb through the fish's mouth. Now, what rod you're using will definitely play into this, but something that I've seen guys make the mistake of, and something that I have made the mistake of, is having that drag too loose, that when you set the hook with that lure, you will have a little bit of line that comes out. Now, sometimes having just a little bit of line is okay, but if you have too much line kind of come out on that hook set, you are not going to penetrate that fish's mouth, and you're going to lose a lot of fish because of that. Now, some guys will actually loosen their drag up if they're fighting a really big fish to allow that fish to take line, and sometimes they forget to tighten it up. Now, one thing that I kind of prefer to do is I keep my drag pretty locked down, and I will actually just click on the button and use my thumb as the drag.
Good one?
I think it's a decent fish. I think it'll for sure call, but some guys may actually argue against that, and that is fine. If you do it a different way, as long as you're putting fish in the boat, that is what is important. I just feel that using my thumb, I actually have more control over what line is going out, and that's what I really like. Another huge thing when it comes to drag is that sometimes if you go on long boat rides, maybe you go on a half-an-hour boat ride and your drag and your reels are kind of bouncing a lot, sometimes that will actually loosen up the drag of your reel. And so when you go to make a cast and a fish hits your bait and you set the hook, there might be too much line again that comes out and you might lose that fish. That actually happened to me in a local championship a couple years ago, and I lost a really big fish, a fish that would have got big bass and won us the tournament because of my drag. I really believe that getting that hook past the barb will drastically help you to land more fish, and you really can't do that too well with a loose drag. The third mistake that a lot of guys make with a bait caster is they waste money on fishing line. The biggest reason that they waste so much money on fishing line is because they don't use some sort of backing on their reel. A lot of bait casters these days, even low profile bait casters, are gonna hold 100, 125 yards of line. Now, if you're using that particular reel to throw a spinnerbait along the shoreline, you might only really be using 30 yards of that line, maybe 40 yards of the line. So instead of wasting that 50 or 60 yards of line that's sitting at the base of your spool, what you want to do is just fill it with a cheaper line. This is not something new. There's been professional bass fishermen that have been doing this for years, but I still see a lot of guys, especially if they are new to a bait caster, wasting a lot of line by not using a backing. This particular line here, it's just Berkley Trilene Big Game Mono line. This is 650 yards that I've had for like 3 years. I use it as backing and I spent like $6 on this whole spool. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna fill about 30, 40, 50 yards of line on my bait caster with this cheaper line. So I'm gonna use a cheap line to create that backing, and then I'm going to attach my main line that I like. Maybe it's an expensive fluorocarbon to that cheaper line. So the big thing here, you don't need to know a fancy knot in order to tie that monofilament to a fluorocarbon line. I use like a really simple overhand knot that anybody can tie. You never want to get down to that knot while you are fighting a fish. If you make a long cast and that knot comes out, or you're fighting a fish and that knot comes out, it's going to break. It's not a strong knot at all. But in 15 years of me using backing on Baitcast reels, I have never gotten down to that knot at all. I always change my line before I get down to that knot. So if you're using a bait caster, I really suggest using some sort of backing. It's gonna help you to save some money on that expensive fishing line. If you wanna watch the video that I made on skipping with a bait caster, I'm gonna link that video right here. Also, don't forget to check out Sportsman's Outfitters for all your fishing and hunting needs right here. Subscribe to the channel, comment below, and I'll see you guys in the next video.